also continue getting reactions following the passing of the last apartheid president, FW De Klerk. Now, apartheid leaders have faced scrutiny over their human rights records, with mounting pressure to finally face justice after revelations and a lack of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Meanwhile, the former commissioners have called for an inquiry into the TRC cases, as some family members still seek closure after their loved ones perished at the hands of the oppressive apartheid government. Let's discuss more on this. I'm joined by Dr. Marjorie Jobson, who is the National Director of Khulumani Support Group. Dr. Jobson, thank you very much for your time. Now, there have been mounting calls for justice, mounting calls for those who haven't stood trial, who hold information, to be given the opportunity to do so. Talk to us about Khulumani and the role that you play in this dynamic.
Thank you, Thami. So, for Khulumani, we have a legacy of unresolved cases. The particular cases that are on the agenda now are largely the cases of people who died in political detention. That is a small fraction of what still needs to be dealt with, and progress on those cases has been incredibly slow. We discovered the reasons for all the delays, and there are multiple reasons. Politically, there was some deals that actually postponed these cases being dealt with. We were warned by the attorney who defended all the perpetrators at the amnesty hearings that you are never going to get anywhere, because if they dare to start prosecuting us or the people he defended, we will spill the beans on everything we know about the other side of the story. So that was the big threat. And then the other very big problem has been that most of our agencies, judiciary, intelligence, security, retained the services of people who were involved in institutions like the Civil Cooperation Bureau, and they are still in the police. And even this week, we had an encounter with one of the CCP. So they are still very, very active. And we didn't implement any kind of vetting policy on lustration. What we are glad about is that Shamila Buttoy has now created a separate unit to do these TRC cases. And she claims that she has vetted the 16 people in that unit very, very carefully. So it seems there is a little bit of progress now, but there is so much still to unearth and to help bring, resolution to families and justice for the victims' families.
Talk to us about the various categories that the TRC had put in place as far as who will testify, like the CATS categories, for example, and what are the numbers that we're talking about here?
Right, so the TRC had to limit the scope of what it could deal with. We understand that. It couldn't deal with the critical foundational issue of land dispossession, so it focused on crimes that are considered to be egregious crimes, like arbitrary killings of people. All the deaths in detention would be those because they all happened under torture. Torture was another crime that they could had a mandate over. And then there was the abductions. Those were the cases of people who were forcibly abducted and who usually disappeared. Very many of those cases are unresolved, and nobody knows what has happened to most of the bodies of the people who were abducted. And then a category that is very nondescript in terms of severe ill treatment, and so everything else had to fit into that category. It included property crimes, looting and theft of livestock, things like rape, because there was no special focus on gender-based crimes in the TRC, and we trace back the failure to deal with gender-based violence because of the lack of the TRC actually in imagining that where all these crimes originally started. So those were the main categories. The number of people who actually managed to table statements with the TRC was very, very limited. So we sit with a vast legacy of very damaged very traumatized people who have suffered those 4 categories of crimes. And so we would love to see more of a balance between solving, the cases of the perpetrators of the crimes and the cases of the victims of the same crimes, because there's a gross imbalance there. And one of the first steps in bringing remedies to people is to acknowledge the harm that they suffered. And that has not yet happened to the majority of people in the country, which leaves this vast pool of rage that we deal with almost every day. And that's something that we long to actually have the opportunity to deal with.
We saw, Dr. Jobson, a large number of perpetrators either refusing to testify at the TRC. Some were denied this amnesty. But you also spoke about the deals that were made that have allowed the non-continuance of the TRC. What role are you as a Khulumani going to be playing, as well as other agencies, in ensuring that those stories get told and that the perpetrators are actually being brought to book?
This is actually very difficult. The cases that the TRC handed over to the NPA at the end of the investigations and amnesty hearings, there were only 350 that we know of. They were put into 4 different piles, and nobody can trace those piles of documents. So there was a whole interference with actually all the evidence that people had accumulated. But what are we doing? Well, we have a relationship with the special unit that Shamina Botoy has put in place. We have multiple cases that people log with us in which they are searching for the truth. It's led to the delays have made the situation very untenable. And in many ways, one of the things that has happened is that families have I think it's a very good move, have been claiming their own voices, because then the public can realize how big this problem really is. So I think there's nothing to stop us from finishing this job in a proper way.
And going back to the late President FW De Klerk, what role did he play in the TRC? Was he helpful at all?
And sadly, his walking out of the TRC was one of the most disappointing things to have happened. And I don't think that at the time he realized the depth of the harm that the people who served the country as operatives in the apartheid security agencies, actually he didn't understand how deep that harm was. And I think it's only as he's aged that he's come to realize the terrible things that would do in a much more meaningful way. I mean, we tried, as soon as he set up his FW De Klerk Foundation, we applied to have dialogues with him, and we were never given the opportunity. But I think, as I know from experience of also working with, when perpetrators come to us also to offload, it is a phenomenon that as you age, you start to want to reckon with these demons, and many of the demons have not been put to rest yet, and it could only happen through proper engagement between the victims, survivors, and the perpetrators. So we continue on that course as well, trying to encourage those kinds of dialogues and connections.
You must have seen, Dr. Jobson, the recording of FW De Klerk, which was released after his passing, where he asks for an apology from the victims of apartheid. Does it have any sort of impact to the victims? Does it go any long way as far as what an apology should be and how an apology was expected?
Thami, the problem with an apology is there has to be consequences to the apology. And I mean, victims will tell you, we don't really want your apology. We just want the truth. That is the greatest remedy you can give us. So I think for his sake, he wanted to apologize. I think he was quite an ethical man, but it doesn't provide the necessary satisfaction to the victims. It really doesn't count for them.
And what would be satisfactory for the victims at this point, and considering the fact that FW De Klerk is no more?
And there is so much still to be done. I mean, we have been doing some work with a forensic investigator and actually being able to give victims the truth of what really happened, because the problem with our amnesty hearings was there were no witnesses ever who witnessed what these perpetrators did to people. So you relied entirely only on the way they spun their stories, and we know that most of the stories didn't ring true to the victim. That's what they always told us. And so until people like when De Klerk reaches this age, and very interestingly, I'm a medical doctor, and he died from a mesothelioma, which actually completely it constricts your breathing. So it's like he lived the fact that people under these kinds of conditions of apartheid would call, we can't breathe, like George Floyd in the US. And I think it's quite an irony that De Klerk should have died from a mesothelioma.
Wow.
And because this was suffocating, people have suffocated in this country, and suffocation was one of the main instruments of torture.